Chapter 2. From Trade to Territory, the company establishes power. Aurangzeb was the last of the powerful Mughal rulers. He established control over a very large part of the territory that is now known as India. After his death in 1707, many Mughal governors or subedars and big zamindars began asserting their authority and establishing regional kingdoms. As powerful regional kingdoms emerged in various parts of India, Delhi could no longer function as an effective centre. By the second half of the 18th century, however, a new power was emerging on the political horizon, the British. Did you know that the British originally came as a small trading company and were reluctant to acquire territories? How then did they come to be masters of a vast empire? In this chapter, you will see how this came about. East India Company comes east. In the year 1600, the East India Company acquired a charter from the ruler of England, Queen Elizabeth I, granting it the sole right to trade with the East. This meant that no other trading group in England could compete with the East India Company. With this charter, the company could venture across the oceans looking for new lands from which it could buy goods at a cheap price and carry them back to Europe to sell at higher prices. The company did not have to fear competition from other English trading companies. Mercantile trading companies in those days made profit primarily by excluding competition so that they could buy cheap and sell dear. Mercantile means a business enterprise that makes profit primarily through trade, buying goods cheap and selling them at higher prices. The Royal Charter, however, could not prevent other European powers from entering the eastern markets. By the time the first English ships sailed down the west coast of Africa, round the Cape of Good Hope, and crossed the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese had already established their presence in the western coast of India and had their base in Goa. In fact, it was Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, who had discovered this sea route to India in 1498. By the early 17th century, the Dutch too were exploring the possibilities of trade in the Indian Ocean. Soon, the French traders arrived on the scene. The problem was that all the companies were interested in buying the same thing. The fine quality of cotton and silk produced in India had a big market in Europe. Pepper, cloves, cardamom, and cinnamon too were in great demand. Competition amongst the European companies inevitably pushed up the prices at which these goods could be purchased, and this reduced the profits that could be earned. The only way the trading companies could flourish was by eliminating rival competitors. The urge to secure markets therefore led to fierce battles between the trading companies. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, they regularly sank each other's ships, blockaded routes, and prevented rival ships from moving with supplies of goods. Trade was carried on with arms, and trading posts were protected through fortification. This effort to fortify settlements and carry on profitable trade also led to intense conflict with local rulers. The company, therefore, found it difficult to separate trade from politics. Let us see how this happened. East India Company begins trade in Bengal. The first English factory was set up on the banks of the river Hooghly in 1651. This was the base from which the company's traders known at that time as factors, operated. The factory had a warehouse where goods for export were stored, and it had offices where company officials sat. As trade expanded, the company persuaded merchants and traders to come and settle near the factory. By 1696, it began building a fort around the settlement. 2 years later, it bribed Mughal officials into giving the company zamindari rights over 3 villages. One of these was Calicut, which later grew into the city of Calcutta or Kolkata as it is known today. It also persuaded the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb to issue a farman granting the company the right to trade duty-free. A farman means a royal edict or a royal order. The company tried continuously to press for more concessions and manipulate existing privileges. Aurangzeb's farman, for instance, had granted only the company the right to trade duty-free. But officials of the company who were carrying on private trade on the side were expected to pay duty. This they refused to pay, causing an enormous loss of revenue for Bengal. How could the Nawab of Bengal, Murshid Quli Khan, not protest? How trade led to battles. Through the early 18th century, the conflict between the company and the Nawabs of Bengal intensified. After the death of Aurangzeb, the Bengal Nawabs asserted their power and autonomy as other regional powers were doing at that time. Murshid Quli Khan was followed by Alwardi Khan and then Sirajudullah as the Nawab of Bengal. Each of them was a strong ruler. They refused to grant the company concessions, demanded large tributes for the company's right to trade, denied it any right to mint coins, and stopped it from extending its fortifications. Accusing the company of deceit, they claimed that the company was depriving the Bengal government of huge amounts of revenue and undermining the authority of the Nawab. It was refusing to pay taxes, writing disrespectful letters, and trying to humiliate the Nawab and his officials. The company, on its part, declared that the unjust demands of the local officials were ruining the trade of the company, and trade could flourish only if the duties were removed. It was also convinced that to expand trade, it had to enlarge its settlements, buy up villages, and rebuild its forts. The conflict led to confrontations and finally culminated in the famous Battle of Plassey. The Battle of Plassey. When Alwardi Khan died in 1756, Sirajudullah became the Nawab of Bengal. The company was worried about his power and keen on a puppet ruler who would willingly give trade concessions and other privileges. Puppet, well, it means literally a toy that you can move with strings. The term is used disapprovingly to refer to a person who is controlled by someone else. So it tried, though without success, to help one of Sirajuddaullah's rivals become the Nawab. An infuriated Sirajuddaulah asked the company to stop meddling in the political affairs of his dominion, stop fortification, and pay the revenues. After negotiations failed, the Nawab marched with 30,000 soldiers to the English factory at Qasim Bazar, captured the company officials, locked the warehouse, disarmed all Englishmen, and blockaded English ships. Then he marched to Calcutta to establish control over the company's fort there. On hearing the news of the fall of Calcutta, company officials in Madras sent forces under the command of Robert Clive, reinforced by naval fleets. Prolonged negotiations with the Nawab followed. Finally, in 1757, Robert Clive led the company's army against Siraj-ud-Dawla at Plassey. One of the main reasons for the defeat of the Nawab was that the forces led by Mir Jafar, one of Siraj-ud-Dawla's commanders, never fought the battle. Clive had managed to secure his support by promising to make him Nawab after crushing Siraj-ud-Dawla. The Battle of Plassey became famous because it was the first major victory the company won in India. After the defeat at Plassey, Siraj-ud-Dawla was assassinated and Mir Jafar made the Nawab. The company was still unwilling to take over the responsibility of administration. Its prime objective was the expansion of trade. If this could be done without conquest, through the help of local rulers who were willing to grant privileges, then territories need not be taken over directly. Soon the company discovered that this was rather difficult, for even the puppet Nawabs were not always as helpful as the company wanted them to be. After all, they had to maintain a basic appearance of dignity and sovereignty if they wanted respect from their subjects. What could the company do? When Mir Jafar protested, the company deposed him and installed Mir Qasim in his place. When Mir Qasim complained, he in turn was defeated in a battle fought at Buxar in 1764, driven out of Bengal, and Mir Jafar was reinstalled. The Nawab had to pay ₹5 lakh every month, but the company wanted more money to finance its wars and meet the demands of trade and its other expenses. It wanted more territories and more revenue. By the time Mir Jafar died in 1765, the mood of the company had changed. Having failed to work with puppet Nawabs, Clive declared, "We must indeed become Nawabs ourselves." Finally, in 1765, the Mughal emperor appointed the company as the Diwan of the provinces of Bengal. The Diwani allowed the company to use the vast revenue resources of Bengal. This solved a major problem that the company had earlier faced. From the early 18th century, its trade with India had expanded, but it had to buy most of the goods in India with gold and silver imported from Britain. This was because, at this time, Britain had no goods to sell in India. The outflow of gold from Britain slowed after the Battle of Plassey and entirely stopped after the assumption of Diwani. Now, revenues from India could finance company expenses. These revenues could be used to purchase cotton and silk textiles in India, maintain company troops, and meet the cost of building the company fort and offices at Calcutta. The promise of riches. The territorial ambitions of the mercantile East India Company were viewed with distrust and doubt in England. After the Battle of Plassey, Robert Clive wrote to William Pitt, one of the principal secretaries of the state to the English monarch, on 7th January 1759 from Calcutta. But so large a sovereignty may possibly be an object too extensive for a mercantile company. I flatter myself that there will be little or no difficulty in obtaining the absolute possession of these rich kingdoms. Now, I leave you to judge whether an income yearly of 2 million sterling with the possession of 3 provinces be an object deserving the public attention. The Nawab complains. In 1733, the Nawab of Bengal said this about the English traders. When they first came into the country, they petitioned the then government in a humble manner for liberty to purchase a spot of ground to build a factory house upon, which was no sooner granted, but they built a strong fort, surrounded it with a ditch which had communication with the river, and mounted a great number of guns upon the walls. They have enticed several merchants and others to go and take protection under them, and they collect a revenue which amounts to rupees 1 lakh. They rob and plunder and carry great number of the king's subjects of both sexes into slavery into their own country. Company officials become nabobs. What did it mean to be Nawabs? It meant, of course, that the company acquired more power and authority. But it also meant something else. Each company servant began to have visions of living like Nawabs. After the Battle of Plassey, the actual Nawabs of Bengal were forced to give land and vast sums of money as personal gifts to company officials. Robert Clive himself amassed a fortune in India. He had come to Madras, now Chennai, from England in 1743 at the age of 18. When in 1767 he left India, his Indian fortune was worth 4,01,102 pounds. Interestingly, when he was appointed governor of Bengal in 1764, he was asked to remove corruption in company administration, but he was himself cross-examined in 1772 by the British Parliament, which was suspicious of his vast wealth. Although he was acquitted, he committed suicide in 1774. However, not all company officials succeeded in making money like Clive. Many died an early death in India due to disease and war, and it would not be right to regard all of them as corrupt and dishonest. Many of them came from humble backgrounds, and their uppermost desire was to earn enough in India, return to Britain, and lead a comfortable life. Those who managed to return with wealth led flashy lives and flaunted their riches. They were called nabobs, an anglicized version of the Indian word Nawab. They were often seen as upstarts and social climbers in British society and were ridiculed or made fun of in plays and cartoons. How did Clive see himself? At his hearing in front of a committee in Parliament, Clive declared that he had shown admirable restraint after the Battle of Plassey. This is what he said. Consider the situation in which the victory at Plassey had placed me. A great prince was dependent on my pleasure. An opulent city lay at my mercy. Its richest bankers bid against each other for my smiles. I walked through vaults which were thrown open to me alone, piled on either hand with gold and jewels. Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my moderation. Company rule expands. If we analyze the process of annexation of Indian states by the East India Company from 1757 to 1857, certain key aspects emerge. The company rarely launched a direct military attack on an unknown territory. Instead, it used a variety of political, economic, and diplomatic methods to extend its influence before annexing an Indian kingdom. After the Battle of Buxar in 1764, the company appointed residents in Indian states. They were political or commercial agents, and their job was to serve and further the interests of the company. Through the residents, the company officials began interfering in the internal affairs of Indian states. They tried to decide who was to be the successor to the throne and who was to be appointed in administrative posts. Sometimes the company forced the state into a subsidiary alliance. According to the terms of this alliance, Indian rulers were not allowed to have their independent armed forces. They were to be protected by the company, but had to pay for the subsidiary forces that the company was supposed to maintain for the purpose of this protection. If the Indian rulers failed to make the payment, then part of their territory was taken away as penalty. For example, when Richard Wesley was Governor General from 1798 to 1805, the Nawab of Awadh was forced to give over half of his territory to the company in 1801 as he failed to pay for the subsidiary forces. Hyderabad was also forced to cede territories on similar grounds. What power did the resident have? This is what James Mill, the famous economist and political philosopher from Scotland, wrote about the resident appointed by the company. We place a resident who really is king of the country, whatever injunctions of non-interference he may act under. Injunction means instruction. As long as the prince acts in perfect subservience, subservience means submissiveness, and does what is agreeable to the residents, that is, to the British government, things go on quietly. They are managed without the resident appearing much in the administration of affairs. But when anything of a different nature happens, the moment the prince takes a course which the British government think wrong, then comes clashing and disturbance.